Welcome to the Conduit Deeper podcast, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the details that surround our current sermon series, from current events to fascinating finds to conversations that take us deeper into the Word. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the Deeper Podcast. My name is Mo, executive pastor at Conduit Church, joined with our lead pastor, Darren Tyler. And today, special guest, our friend Kevin Kookogey, who is a fellow Conduit, entertainment attorney, author, and our local rebel rouser that likes to stir trouble every now and then, in a good way.
Yeah.
In the best of ways, of course.
He's the rouser you want in your
You
corner.
want this rouser,
The rouser
on your team. And Kevin, you may not remember this. When we first crossed paths, I don't know if you remember this, but we crossed paths about 15 years ago when we had a shared office space in Cool Springs. And it was this conglomerate of three different companies all in the same building. And I was tucked back in this far back office with no windows. I don't know if anybody remembered I was back there. But you had the front office because you were the boss.
I don't think I had the front office in that building.
Well, you were the opposite side of me. All I knew. That's all I knew.
Are you talking about Autumn Springs Court office?
No.
No, it would have been off of
Crossroads.
It
was with InPop.
But not the one we're in now.
I don't know where you're at now, but InPop Records.
Because there was a time period where I was kind of on a sabbatical when I was full-time managing, and it's like a 5-year period. But the funny thing is, you'd mentioned that to me when we first started attending Conduit, and I was like, wait, Mo, you were at the office?
Well, exactly.
I was trying to picture what you looked like.
Exactly. I mean, it's been a minute. It was about 15 years ago, but there's a management company, and
there was a lot going on.
A couple of management companies and a record label, and everybody was kind of stuck back there. And so, anyways, that's when I first learned your name, because one of my favorite bands at the time, I realized that you were a part of. You were managing. Which was, I don't know if we can say.
Yeah, you can say it.
Yeah, Mute Math at the time.
Mute Math?
No,
it's like
Mute
Christopher Walken.
Yeah, exactly.
Mute Math.
You like that?
No. The emphasis is on the first word. Mute Math.
Such a great band, but even before then, I knew them as Earthsuit. I don't know if were you along for the Earthsuit ride?
Yeah, my history was Earthsuit called me, the band from New Orleans. Called me in the fall of 1999 to represent them just for the purpose of negotiating the record contract with Sparrow Records.
Was that Paul Meany?
Yeah.
Yep.
It was Paul Meany. But it wasn't, Darren King wasn't part of that band, although actually Darren was kind of an associate. Paul kind of mentored him, and so Darren played some Earthsuit shows. And, I come from a music background, Berklee College of Music undergrad.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I work in the music field, but I didn't have music that really inspired me. And when I saw Earthsuit perform at a showcase, a Sparrow showcase, after they had signed, that was the first time where I said, this band really inspires me musically. And they didn't have a manager, so I threw my hat in the ring and said, I know I'm your lawyer, but would you consider me to be your manager? And of course, that made everybody at Sparrow really upset.
I bet they had meetings about that.
And that was actually what drove the band to me, because they're like, oh, if the label doesn't want you to be our manager, that's who we want to choose.
That's a smart band, by the way. That is not immediately obvious to most bands. Like the label tries to sign them, and then, hey, here's my buddy, an attorney that you can work with, and and not realizing that we might have competing goals here.
Yeah.
Would you have been at that showcase, Darren?
99?
Yeah, it would have been
Earthsuit?
December of 99. It was downtown. I forget the venue.
SIR or something like that.
Oh, I was there.
You were there?
I don't doubt
I was
it.
still at William Morris Agency.
Okay.
We passed with enthusiasm because we weren't cool. You wanted music that inspired you. I wanted music that fed my family, and those.
Yeah. I tried to make both happen.
Yeah,
So.
that's not an easy needle to thread, right?
Yeah.
Like usually, if I loved the band, I'm like, oh, but this is not going to sell. And if I was like, meh, then that was going to pay the rent for the year. But
So when did you cross paths with Kevin specifically then?
so Kevin and I never sat across the table from each other, but his name was on a lot of contracts because he.
Well, my name wasn't on the contracts. My name was the one that was pushing the contracts.
Well, maybe it was the email. Whatever. So yeah, that which is kind of funny to me, because in those days we would have been on opposite sides of the table, and as the last 15 years have unfolded, I find myself on the same side of the table. Theologically, politically. With many, and by the way, some of the people that I was on the same side of the table with in the music business in the last 15 years, I've realized I couldn't be more opposite ends of the planet. It was like a reshuffling of the deck.
It really was.
So honestly, when I come across like you and realize, okay, someone's holding the line, because I don't know about for you, but there was a little bit where I'm like, am I the only guy? Like copping an Elijah complex. There's nobody holy but me.
Yep.
But so that was, let's start with that. So part of what I was, and I don't know why we haven't done this sooner, because your book, An Apologetic for Liberty, and if you haven't got that book, it's an easy, quick read, but it's really important. But you came out of that world and somehow decided you were looking around stuff in the world that was not matching up with reality, and you just couldn't shut up about it, which has caused all kinds of consequences in your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Costs. And you were there before. Before guys like me. I remember starting to see your name on the podcasts and interviews, and was like, man, he's really passionate. But I was still catching up to how important the work was that you're doing.
Yeah, it kind of came to a head. Let me, for those who don't know, a little bit of background. So as Darren says, we were in the music industry, didn't really cross paths directly. I don't think at all directly. Everything was kind of circumspect.
Yeah,
right?
Lawyers in the middle, and I'm on one side talking to
manager,
my lawyer.
booking agent, lawyers. But that was during a lot of our interaction, though, would have happened when I was representing Tooth and Nail Records, Brandon Ebel, one of my early and favorite clients. And during that process, I got so busy that ironically it became a little boring. And when I came to town, 1992, my wife and I moved here from Philadelphia right after I got out of law school. And I didn't want to do anything other than that. It was so exciting for me to get to be an entertainment lawyer and actually get to represent artists, record companies, publishers. But after doing it for 4 or 5 years, it started to get kind of monotonous, which was hard for me to. I'm like, why is this monotonous? This is what I wanted to do. This is my dream job. Notwithstanding the fact that I'm still doing it 33 years later. And it's how God has blessed me, and it's how he's fed my family. But yeah, you're right, Darren. There was a time that probably about 2019, about really, ironically, about the time I started managing, when I managed Earthsuit, and then that band folded and became Mute Math later. And I was doing my own thing while I was doing this work on this side. In my free time, I was getting involved politically. I started off as treasurer of Williamson County Republican Party. Then I was asked by a group of conservatives to actually run as chairman. I wasn't looking to be the chairman, but I had a really good friend of mine that came to me on another book that I'd written. He said, Kevin, can you come to lunch? I'm like, sure. And I sat down, and he put down my little book, and which was really similar in size and feel to An Apologetic for Liberty, but it was my Linchpins of Liberty book. And he said, Kevin, he said, we need this kind of challenge to the Republican establishment. Will you consider running for chair? And I said, this was 3 weeks before the party realignment, and every 2 years they have an election. And I said, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. I need to pray about it. He said, well, pray about it quickly, because I'm going to bring a bunch of friends to support you if you're willing to do this. I said, well, let me first have a conversation with the current chair, who happened to be a friend of mine, who then became an enemy of mine, not by my choosing, but because he became repulsed to the fact that I would dare challenge him. I said, well, I've been asked by a conservative base to run. And so that, we got in a lot of battles at that time. If you go back and Google those years, you'll see my name hated by the Republican establishment, not only in Williamson County, but across the state, called out by the governor. In fact, some of the things we did were so bothersome to former Governor Bill Haslam that when I was Tennessee state chair for Ted Cruz in 2015 and 2016, Haslam prevented me from being a delegate, and it was purely based on old baggage that he had against me from back in 2012. So it's kind of a badge of honor, because what I did was done with integrity, but it really ruffled the feathers of the establishment.
Yeah, the thing that when I think about, even like when it comes to the local stuff, like I feel like I don't really fit in either party, seems like anymore at all. But especially in those days, like there was a clear choice, right? If you just once we're down to one or the other, then okay, well, there's a clear choice. But in the primaries, it was like, man, we definitely need to push some of these buttons, like push back on some stuff that's just just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean that's the way that we need to continue to do it.
Yeah, and I felt that what was interesting, Darren, is that when I finished my term, I only did a 2-year term, and that's about all that's all I could take really, because it was nothing but conflict for 2 years, and it wasn't my job.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, I had local reporters calling me, and I would say, I'll call you when I finish my workday, and they'd be like, what do you mean your workday? Isn't this your job? I'm like, no, this is volunteer. Oh, we thought you were paid. I'm like, no, the state party chair gets paid. This is volunteer. He's like, oh, it was a whole new world. Right. He thought living in Williamson County, Republican Party chair must get paid. Yeah. So after finishing that 2 years, that's when I immediately got thrust into this whole IRS matter, which is the Jay secular thing.
Yeah,
Let's talk about
that. So I mentioned Jay on Sunday.
Yes.
We are only even a church really because of Jay getting us where we are. Which I'm eternally grateful for. I mean, I couldn't be more grateful. But around that same time, when my little piddly high school, it was like a nickel and dime. Like for Jay, that was literally, we're just going to send a letter and move in. Yours was way more complicated than that.
It became much more complicated. But let me set up the journey and how it happened, because it's amazing. And what I said to my wife Bonnie in church on Sunday was, what's beautiful is that God was doing that in our lives at the same time. This is where I get emotional. See, this is there's such a beautiful poetry that God aligns there. So in 2010, when you were dealing with Independence High School, I didn't yet know Jay personally. My association with Jay was limited to when I was in law school. I used to watch him on the television, and American Center for Law and Justice was very new then, late 80s, early 90s.
Brand new.
And so I hadn't met him yet, but I filed a 501c3 application for a little organization that I had founded called Linchpins of Liberty. And the mission of Linchpins of Liberty was to challenge the imagination of the rising generation. I mentored high school and college students in moral and political philosophy to give them a taste for freedom and the skills to be free. Driven by Christian principles, biblical leadership, and I filed my C3. Well, in a normal environment, this is during the Obama administration, in a normal environment, when you file your C3, within a couple of months, you get your letter back saying, fine, you got your status, right? Well, first of all, it took 4 months for me to get my letter back. And when I got the letter back, it had 95 questions asking me such things as, we need to know your political affiliation. We need to know the names of the students that you mentor. These were minors. Most of them were minors. They wanted to know the address. They wanted copies of all the speeches that I had given, or speeches that people that I had come to my events had given. It was outrageous, and I was overwhelmed because I thought I was alone. And at that time, I felt like I was alone. Well, scroll forward to the end of that year, because I said, call the agent and work through this. I could never get an agent on the line until the end of 2011. And I finally got an agent from Cincinnati.
Let's go.
And he was completely honest with me, Mo. So the honesty of Cincinnati came out, and he said,
great.
These are key words. He said, we finally got guidance from our superiors as to yours and all of the other cases. I'm like, there's others? And we will issue them on a first in, first out basis. I said, when will that be? They said about 8 weeks. So scroll forward 8 weeks later, February of 2012, and the proverbial poop hit the fan nationally. Hundreds and hundreds of conservative Christian organizations were being targeted by the IRS. We knew then that we all had gotten the same letters, and it was essentially viewpoint discrimination. It was so blatant. They were telling me, Kevin, if you change the wording of your founding documents, if you change your mission statement to say what we want it to say, we'll approve your 501c3 status. If you don't, we won't. So this is how I met Jay. The first call was a national call. Jay and his office were on the phone, and there were 400 groups. At the end of that call, there were only 40 groups who were willing to tackle the IRS. Everybody else was politically intimidated, which shows you, by the way, that the government had already achieved most of its destiny in that process. The rest of us said, no, this is important for our families. It's important for the future of America. We need to do this for personal integrity.
Hold the line.
Yeah. So Jay said, we'll fund it because that's what we do. We're a national organization, so you don't have to hire a lawyer. but we need you to be with us. And so for the first year, it was an administrative procedure. They handled each of our cases one by one until, you remember the name Lois Lerner, right? Until May of 2013, when Lois Lerner, there had been an IG report in May 10th of 2013 that was coming out. And so to get ahead of that news dump, Lois Lerner went before a bunch of lawyers and said, hey, by the way, there's a couple of rogue agents in Cincinnati who did this on their own. Now, I already knew right away. I'm like, the guy told me he was getting advice from his superiors. The best thing about that was that it gave us the grounds to file a lawsuit because now they admitted to doing something. And my life completely changed from that day. Okay, this was a Friday night. Sunday, I was on local television, local radio. Monday, I was called by the Wall Street Journal who wanted to do a feature story on me. They sent their photographer down here, did like the full thing, was blown up. Wednesday, I was on Megyn Kelly when she had a daytime program, and Jay Sekulow was with me, and he got that opportunity for me. And because that went so well, then I began to become the spokesperson for the organization. And I got media hit. And back in those days, it wasn't wearing your little earbuds and sitting in front of your computer. They actually sent a limo into my neighborhood, picked me up, took me to the studio north of Nashville.
Well, but to put it clearly, it's like an hour north. Like
Yes.
It's not near here.
Yes, so when you're doing a Fox and Friends hit at 6 a.m. Eastern, you got to get up at 4 to be picked up by the limo, to be taken an hour for a 5-minute spot, right? And you're sitting in this cavernous room, completely dark, and all you see is the little red dot on top of the camera, and you look right into it. You've got the Nashville background in the behind you, right? But you have to be smiley and on top of your game and say, I've got 3 minutes to tell the world my story, right? What's fascinating about the Mute Math connection is I had been on the other side of the camera. Mute Math had been on all the national television programs. I had been with them on television. I had seen how that process worked. And it was like God was training me for that for the previous 10 or 15 years. And when the lights went on, I loved it. I mean, I can't say that I didn't love that process. Now, that the subject matter was very serious. But Jay was with us through that process. So as a result of that, I actually, on June 4th, 2013, I was the first of 6 IRS targets to testify. So I was actually the first over all the matters, because this was the hubbub, this was the big committee, and it was all over national news. And this is what broke apart my relationship with Mute Math. So at that time, I'd taken a hiatus from my law practice. We had a joint venture with Warner Brothers in Los Angeles, and so I spent every month flying out to Burbank, and I couldn't uphold my law practice at the same time, so it took a 4 or 5 year break. And so most of my income, probably 75% of my income, came because of my Mute Math work and Teleprompt, the company that we owned. So during that time, I had a lot of eggs in one basket, and yet this whole IRS thing, thrust me onto the national scene. By the way, prior to my testimony on June 4th, 2013, most of my media hits were conservative media, Fox News and things of that nature. Wall Street Journal, not that you can call them conservative, well, not even call Fox conservative anymore, right?
Right.
But on the day of my testimony, it went viral like nobody's business. And so I knew that there's no way that this was not going to be something that the band was seeing and wanted to talk about. And sure enough, so the day after, because the morning of testimony, I'm on 2 national television programs, testify in front of the world, getting the most encouraging communications, texts and emails from China, from Poland, people from all over the world saying, we're encouraging you, praying for you, supporting you in your fight for liberty. It was overwhelming. Ended that day with a... do you know John Eastman, the attorney that's been... Yeah. So John Eastman and I we both testified that day together, and then we both appeared on Greta Van Susteren that night. And when I got in the limo, again, it's funny, this is the days when it was all limo television, was driven back to the house where I stayed in D.C., and one of my friends who used to keep track of the media hits, he's like, he'd say, you're here 20 different places. That day, he's like, Kevin, there's over 300 media pieces. And my children were saying, Daddy, not only are you on television, but even on the stations you're not on, there's pictures of you and they're talking about you and your name's on the bottom. And I'm like, there's no way that Mute Math is going to miss this. So the next morning I get up, I have a meeting at, what's the train station there in D.C., right by the Capitol, whatever that train station is. I'm walking back to the Heritage Foundation, which is where I had a temporary office when I was in and out of D.C. for these IRS matters. And I got a call. Paul Meany's name is on the phone, and I knew, all right, here's the moment of truth. And he said, Kevin, we need to talk. And Paul is a dear friend. I have so much respect for him, and how could you not? I've managed him for 14 years. Like, we live together, and we're, good, bad, and ugly, like a family, right? Love, and respect so much. But he said to me, he's like, if this is just going to be a one-time thing, we can move on. And I said, Paul, I can't promise you where this is going. All I'm doing is defending my constitutional rights. I didn't ask for this, but I can't stop it. It will have its own life. So he said, well, maybe it's time we part ways. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. The amazing thing is, at that moment, by the way, no post-term commissions. I released any kind of,
no sunset clause.
I could have.
Sure.
I let it go.
Wow.
But here's what's really important, and I think it has biblical implications. I didn't know what I was going to do. 75% of my income was going to be gone in like couple. We had like things that we'd worked on. Let's work them out for a couple months. But I felt like God was pushing me off the cliff, right? And I didn't know where that was going to go. I didn't have fear of it. It was kind of exhilarating, but I didn't know where, then my next meal was going to come from, almost literally. But the thing that was beautiful about that is Paul called me back the next day as I'm getting on the plane to fly back to Nashville. He said, I just want you to know we really, really respect what you just did. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you always told us for these 14 years, if we ever had any disagreement and wanted to break the deal, that you would walk away. And he said, we never knew if that was actually true. I was keeping my word, but I wasn't trying to do something special. I was just keeping my word. So that had impact. And the amazing thing, Mo and Darren, is that I've been in plenty and I've been in want. And I was razor thin. My wife and I, before that, got close to bankruptcy, right? We had walked that line, but God has always provided. I mean, it's amazing, the sources. And in fact, while I had one side of my life in the secular world of music business frowning upon me or looking away in embarrassment as I'm up there speaking of my Christian beliefs and defending my rights against the Obama administration, I had a bunch of friends in the Christian music industry who were cheering me on, and I didn't even know it. They were like, Kevin, we're watching you. We're going like, yeah. And that was such an important time of support for me when, it was razor thin. It was tough.
You can see the emotion, that you have from that. And it's been a minute. It's been a while.
Yeah, 12 years.
And it still hits.
It does.
Fresh.
And it's good that it hits fresh, because if I ever get comfortable, I have to remember, no, you know what? In those uncomfortable times, I felt exhilarated about what I was doing. And so I always try to make sure that I'm not getting too comfortable in whatever I'm doing, because I want to be hearing God. I want to make sure that I'm not, there's something about being comfortable that keeps us from being as sharp as we need to be.
Well, the courage that you displayed, because you knew, so you've got a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to make any money off it. So it's not
Which, by the way, was destroyed by the IRS. They delayed it so long that I actually lost everybody that was going to donate. They had to go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, to that end, you could have. What did you say? There was 400. How many?
400 organizations that were on that first call with Jay, and only 10% of them decided to pursue it.
Yeah. So the remarkable thing to me is that they all did the same calculus, right? Which is this is risky. It could cost us financially, cost us certainly socially.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what frustrates me, I vacillate between empathy and fury, is when I think of those other 360 organizations, and you're just going to let this happen. Like, you can't let this happen.
Especially because their missions were not exactly the same with mine, but definitely were on the same side of the aisle.
And to be specific, the IRS was very proactively targeting conservative-based, price, centered, whatever, based organizations, using the power of the government to shut them up.
Right.
That's what they do in Asia.
Yeah.
that's what they do in Pakistan. We can't let that happen here. Like, it makes me furious that, on the one hand, I'm furious at the 360, and then like super, not only grateful, but nothing but respect for you at a time when most people were, like, even I remember seeing it going, and I know Jay, like, I know, and I'm like, is it possible this is really, like, it seems so weird and so extreme that there must have been something else to the story. And
to your point,
yeah.
I have a really good friend. I won't name him, but he's been in political spheres in Tennessee. And at the time he was running for office, one of the federal offices, and he took me out to lunch and he said, Kevin, he basically said, you're imagining this. He didn't use those words, but it was an insult to me. He wasn't buying it. And I'm like, no, this is happening to me.
Even the 95 questions that they came back with.
Yeah, he's like, no, they're not singling you out, Kevin. You know, give them the benefit of the doubt, blah, blah, blah. But to his credit, 2 years later, he took me out to lunch again and apologized profusely. He said,
that's a rare quality.
It's very rare. He said, not only was it happening, he's like, I'm so sorry because it's worse than I imagined. And I said, thank you for saying that, but you realize I felt very lonely at the first meeting because I knew I was being targeted, and this was before I knew there were even hundreds of other organizations. I thought it was just me against the IRS. I'm like, what am I going to do?
What became of those two rogue agents? Like, what ended up being the ruling?
So what's interesting is we knew it went all the way to the top. Because there was a consent decree, we never went through the evidence to actually determine that. But we knew that it went to Eric Holder. We knew that Lois Lerner, that there had been meetings at the White House. Wow. Whether Obama was there or not, it was clearly being directed from on high. The rogue agents, they weren't rogue. That's the thing. They were thrown under the bus. They were just doing what their superiors told them to do. You always see that. In fact, if you want to know if there is an intelligence community action that's happening, they still use the same language. They'll say, oh, some rogue, and fill in the blanks. They still do that to this day. And you can go, aha, that's not really what's happening.
Right. By smearing them with an accusation.
Yeah.
What was the result? Like, where did it resolve?
Yeah.
Obviously, you didn't get the 501c3, right? But
well, we did. So but it didn't matter, right? Martin Luther King, justice delayed is justice denied. They knew if they denied our tax-exempt status that we would immediately have the right to appeal, and they would give us a legal right. So they delayed, and the morning before it went to the district court in D.C., they gave us all our status. And the first judge said, it's a moot point. You got your status. Obviously, American Center for Law and Justice all said, no. We appealed. We actually won at the circuit court, D.C. Circuit Court, which was argued by John Eastman for us. So what's interesting is that John Eastman was one of the plaintiffs in the overall case, but he's such a good lawyer. And I got to sit and had the privilege of watching him argue before the D.C. Circuit Court, and he was amazing. I mean, it was just so spot on. So we won at that level, and then it kind of went, Trump got elected, and that's when it finally got resolved, because the IRS under Trump in 2018 admitted fault, entered a consent decree saying we were wrong, we did discriminate against you because of your point of view, and we promise never to do it again, which changed, of course, when Biden got back into office and they began going after, not specifically my kind of organizations, but they began going after people for viewpoint discrimination, same way.
And then Biden comes in after that. And
that's what I'm saying. He just ignored
changed.
Just ignore the true lawless.
So that leads us to today. Like, so what are your thoughts on what Trump is doing in these first, what are we in, 9 days now?
Yeah.
You have the Department of Government Efficiency. You have, him maybe cleaning house with the IRS, maybe even abolishing the IRS. I'm curious on your take on what's happening.
Yes. So I have to have full disclosure here. I'm on the board of directors of an organization called Center for Renewing America. Center for Renewing America was founded by Russ Vought, director of OMB under Trump 1, and probably this week will be confirmed as OMB. Strong believer. He and I have been.
Wasn't he? Was he on with Tucker?
Yes,
that was the podcast over the fall. Maybe
he was on with Tucker. Just it was during transition period.
Absolutely recommend that podcast.
If you want to learn about the importance of OMB and really understand how it works, well, this is the genius of that. For the last 4 years, Russ. So I'm privileged to be I'm the only non-DC board member on this. I don't know why they asked me, because I'm not that DC class, but they wanted to have that outside input. And I've known Russ for 15 years. For 4 years, everything that you're seeing implemented now, they gameplayed and managed and war gamed all of these things over the last 4 years. And I've got to be honest, what I would say in board meetings, I'm like, this is great, but election integrity, I don't think Trump's going to get elected. And they're like, Kevin, we can't think that way. We still have to prepare as if he's going to get elected. So I've got a lot of friends who know that about me, and they're like, Kevin, you were so pessimistic. I'm like, I was just trying to read the reality, right? And so Trump gets elected, and now what you're seeing, not exclusively, but so much of the intellectual force and the legal machinations and the executive orders, just the mere volume of them, right, flood the system. This is what the Democrats have done for years, and Republicans have sat by saying, what do we do? There's so many. Now we've reversed that on them. We are going to flood the system. Okay, you want to take this one to court? We've got 10 other things you got to worry about over here. Put you guys on the defensive for a change. For example, the IRS is a brilliant example. Republicans and Democrats voted on a bill last year, maybe 2 years ago now, that increased, basically doubled the size of the IRS. Outrageous, right? So what does Trump do? He says, I'm going to take those agents and I'm going to shift them to border security. If you want your job, you'll do border security now, right? Which is brilliant, because not only does it secure our borders, but it also takes care of our IRS problem.
Right.
It's brilliant. And the types of things that he's doing have such moral clarity, right? You think, for example, the DEI initiatives, he didn't just say, it wasn't just mamby-pamby, mealy-mouth, well, we're sorry that some of you might be thinking that you're a man or a woman, and, you might feel that your gender is fluid, but we're going to do this. No, he didn't. He said, if you read the executive order, he said, we will no longer pretend that a man can be a woman and a woman be a man. Where are the Christians saying that?
Right.
This is the thing that I think is stunning. You've got an unbelieving Donald Trump who is saying things in a more biblical fashion, asserting more moral authority than the past 50 years of Christendom. Remarkable.
When so last night I was up till pretty late because I was teaching online a group of church planters in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And their government is not a representative government, obviously. And most of what we have to do there, we do in secret, because their government is very much opposed to the gospel. And I watched them and the courage that they display. They could lose everything just for baptizing somebody, right, in this country is considered a, quote, forced conversion and is punishable by seizure of all of their assets. And yet here are these, few dozen men sitting in the room saying, and I'll do it anyway.
Right.
And I come back to our country. I think this is why it took me a while to catch up, by the way, because I kept thinking, no, that's the stuff that happens in communist countries. Like our system will hold, and all that's, by the way, red-pilled, whatever you want to call it, like I'm all in. But I look at that in their government, and they will 100% resist, and nobody's sending them any emails about Romans 13 or whatever. But coming back home,
or if they do, they're not sending them Acts 4 and 5 along with it.
No, I can't even tell you how many of those Mo and I got. But when you think of that and back home, I think that the naivete that I had was, well, that could never happen here. Now that's over for me. But what would you say to pastors who have been on the fence? And I think a lot of them are on the fence because of a lack of courage, but a lot of them is just a lack of information, and now they're kind of catching up. But what advice would you have for pastors, including me, in this new world? Because one of the things I'm thinking is, we do have a pause, so to speak, on what's happening because of the way that Trump is working right now. But you and I both know that an executive order can be undone the next election.
Yep.
What do you advise? Like, what do you wish you saw you were mentioning Christians and churches that you got an unbelieving president and being more courageous. Like, if you had a bunch of pastors you're sitting in front of right now, what would you say to them?
Well, let's start with Psalm 23, right? Psalm 23 says, God says, I've set before you a table in the presence of your enemies, right? And then Psalm 24 starts with the proclamation that the earth and everything in it belongs to the Lord, the world and all the people in it, right? And I think that the church, number one, misunderstands or has misinterpreted its role. They think of, kind of like you've talked about, and I'm really pleased when you always talk about the gates of hell, right? Those are defensive mechanisms. The church is on the advance. That's why I formed an organization back in all of this time called the Advancing Church. It's kind of dormant, but the whole premise of that is it's the church that's on the advance, right? Against the gates of hell. So if you look at Psalm 23 and 24 together, the picture that is drawn is God is sovereign over everything. Everything belongs to God, right? The believer and the unbeliever, the entire world, the natural world, and everyone in it. And yet God has placed us, right, at a table amidst our enemies. A lot of people view that from the glass half full. They say, oh my goodness, we were all just doing fine, but then God surrounded us by our enemies, and God will rescue us, but we're just going to hang on here. No. The reason that God sets a table for us in the presence of our enemies is so that we remind the enemy that this is God's estate, and they are the ones that trespass, right? God's estate, they trust. Our job, we are ambassadors for Christ, right? As though God is making his appeal through us, right? So the reason, and a lot of Christians say, woe is me, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. The reason it's going to hell in a handbasket, they ought to ask themselves, is because they have not been complying with the Great Commission. This is why I say that Donald Trump is such a rebuke to the American Christian, not all the church, right? We've been praying for relief, right? We've been praying for the opportunity to live according to the created order again. But Christians in the political space in America over the past 50 years have limited their involvement to, I'm going to vote the right way on abortion, I'm going to issue a proclamation for a day of prayer, but they don't actually govern as though the Bible were true, right? So they have a form of godliness, but they don't have, they deny its power, right, as it says in 2 Timothy. So that would be my admonition, and it's something that drives me every day, Darren. I feel like I'm waking up with this constant challenge to the church, and especially to Christian political leaders. When is the last time we had a truly biblical Christian leader in American history? Maybe Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, I couldn't name anybody else.
And have we ever had in America someone like William Wilberforce, right? If you think of Westerns, who by all accounts, he was going to become the Prime Minister of England, right? It was all teed up for him. He had all the right relationships, had the right money and the power, and he becomes a believer and becomes so invested and passionate about the change that's happened in his heart that he makes it his mission for the next 20 years, goes through such personal sacrifice to achieve the end of the slave trade, right? Where are those? I get so upset when I see people just professing Christ from the pews and on their bumper stickers, Jesus is Lord. But when they get into office, they operate on the premise of the world as if the world belongs to the Marxists. Yeah. The Marxists can advance as their highest priority is Marxism. Christians come in and say, well, you know, we live in a pluralistic society. I really can't advance upon my Christian point of view. Baloney. And because they didn't, that's why we got to this place.
So those that, even in our own community, that hear you say that and cry Christian nationalism. I'm thinking of David French.
Oh, yeah. I can tell you a story about that too. Go ahead.
And by the way, I believe guys that we'll be in heaven with, and I don't know if we're going to live next door to each other, but I hear that, and it's almost like a boogeyman creation that now you're a Christian nationalist, sure. And it's a very negative. What do you say to that criticism?
Can I give you a asterisk before that? Footnote? David French actually wrote my brief against the IRS. I had a very close relationship with David French, and I would say David French left the fold because at that time, David French and I had lots of conversations. It's really strange because he was my biggest defender even within the ACLJ. We talked regularly when we prepared for my testimony before Congress. He wrote the brief. We went over the legal arguments. It was incredible. And then, a couple of years later, I'm like, I don't agree with what he's saying. So that's the personal cost, right? Now, if we sat in here, we'd probably get in a big argument. David French and I would not be on the same page. I don't agree with anything that he wrote during COVID, right? I couldn't have disagreed more. But I think it's important to say that, I was in fellowship. It almost felt like I was in fellowship with someone I'm not in fellowship with now. These are the real costs of your belief. But Christian nationalism is nothing other than a tool, as you rightfully point out, to be able to disparage a Christian from advancing on the gospel. But any society, you must have shared values for society to exist. The whole idea of multiculturalism is a myth if we're talking about different ideas. Yes, we have different colored skin, and yes, we come from different parts of the world. But if we come to America and we don't have a shared value about what is true and right, what is the ultimate authority, and how do people live in a society together, a society falls apart. And so this myth that Christian nationalism is a problem it's a pushback against that. They don't want us to have, by the way, the left and the Marxists also agree that we should only have one idea. They will use terms of multiculturalism in order to get their foothold, but once they establish their superiority, it's like, your ideas don't matter. We're marching to our order. So it's not that they don't want the Constitution. They just want a different Constitution. It's not that they don't want an order. They just want order under a different authority. So that's what Christian nationalism, the whole focus on those words, it's meant to disparage and get people scared from taking positions of belief that are true.
Yeah, because if you frame it in just the common sense world, which is, if most of the people that I respect, in fact, almost everybody that I respect the most, they have one thing in common. They are avid followers of Jesus. So their morality, their integrity, their life. Why would I not want that man or woman to represent us in an office? Of course I would want those Christian values represented. I would want our voice at the table. And so on its face, it sounds like this boogeyman, and you don't even have to dig that deep to say, well, then what's the option then? Do you want the godless in charge? Because that's the only other option if we're supposed to withdraw from this. And there are pastors in our own community so when I go back to Independence High School, okay, I was shocked at the pastor friends of mine in town who were, I'm waiting for like the hero's welcome. Yeah, look, he's fighting for us too. This school just can't say no. Like it's going to make, and it has, by the way. Independence has had multiple churches since then. But what I got instead was pastors that were like, yeah, you're kind of poking the hornet's nest a little bit. Like they were not excited at all that we were fighting for our rights. And I said it Sunday, I'd never forget Jay's words. It was a 9-0 victory, Darren. Yeah. There's no wiggle room on this at all. And it turns out he was very right. But the point that I think driving towards is what you said, is that it's easy when it's this ethereal person troll on the internet. For me anyway, that's a whole lot easier, but it got a lot more complicated when it's your friend. So for you, David French, a colleague, like the personal relationship that, and
who advocated the right position and then shifted.
Yeah. And I guess what I was hoping for, and by the way, I'm seeing it happen, by the way. I am seeing this happen more and more and more. Pastors who had misunderstood their assignment as, and that Tim Keller-esque just preach the gospel as if, we have no other roles in society than that. And I agree, the gospel, the middle of everything. But out of that, right, advocating for our rights is it's not only not a sin, I think it's immoral not to do that. And the pastors that I know that have misunderstood the assignment they're catching up, but most of them, like I remember I sat in an airport with a fellow pastor on our way back from Israel. And I was just whiteboarding out like the Middle Eastern political thing that I just thought everybody knew. And this is a pastor of a very large church, and this was we almost missed our flight. This was brand new information to him. So it wasn't that he was intentionally, he just was, and I say ignorant, not in a pejorative way, but he just didn't know. but I'm hoping now that as pastors are awake, that they'll take the time to know, to speak. Well, go ahead.
Well, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, go.
When you talk about pastors' responsibility, because the American Christian politicians are downstream from the churches that they come from, right? So the responsibility does lie with the pastors and the churches that they came from. And I would admonish a pastor to, if he wants to know about his political duty, because there's no escaping it, read the book of Acts. The church was born out of political persecution, right? Paul was beheaded, right? He was beheaded because he refused to recognize the state as the highest authority. The other thing people don't realize is that Jesus, our Lord, was crucified. He wasn't stoned. Crucifixion was the punishment for a political crime, right? Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. There is another king, and it ain't you," right? He was crucified for that, political crimes. The entire church-state relationship was born in political persecution. For the church to say or to believe the myth, which is advanced by the left, right? They want the church to believe this, that the church should not be involved in politics, misunderstands the entire scripture. If you read Acts 4 and 5, which is why I made reference to it when you said Romans 13, first of all, remember 2 Timothy, all scripture is God-breathed, useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness. So all scripture must be interpreted in view of other scripture. Acts 4 and 5 are really instructive because, first of all, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and political leaders come to Paul and the apostles, or Peter and the apostles, and say, "You need to stop preaching in the name of Jesus Christ." First thing he says is, "You be the judge, but we can't stop doing this," right? So they continue to do it. You move to Acts 5, and they re-encounter them. They say, "We thought we told you to stop doing this." And what do they say? They don't say, "Oh my gosh, Romans 13, I got to respect the authorities." He says, "We must obey God rather than man," right? God rather than man. If God created all things, we can't forget that God also created government. Government, when it's in its right role, here's government in its right role, by the way. If government assumes that men are owned by the state, then men belong to the state, government's out of its role. Government is also out of its role if they assume that men belong to themselves, because they don't. Only when government understands that men belong to God, right, who created them and who set them free so that they may obey him, right? That's the purpose of liberty. Then you have a government that's operating in its right sphere. The Christian's duty in the government is, if the government is staying in its lane, then the Christian should obey the government. That's our duty to God. But if the government gets out of its lane, we can't just be casual or silent about it. We actually have a duty to resist that, to call that out. Because if we don't, we're denying Christ. We're denying the lordship of Christ. And to your point, Darren, it purely comes down to comfort. People want to be comfortable. It's human nature. We want to be in heaven. We want to say, "Hey, it's all done." But that's not our job, right? God put us in this time, in this place for a purpose, and people don't like to be uncomfortable.
Independence High School. Going back to that real quick, side note. It's ironic to me that it's called Independence High School.
I've never connected that dot.
Good point, Mo.
And
How is that possible? I've never connected that.
Do you know the address of Independence High School?
Uh-oh. Is it like 1776?
1776 Declaration Way.
Oh my gosh.
How on earth did
Isn't
I
that
not
beautiful?
catch that while we were in the middle of it? Even Jay didn't catch that.
But isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Because even though it had a principle that violated the laws, not only of man, but violated the laws of God, God had preordained that this was actually Declaration Way. I think that's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The first Sunday that we met at Independence, we were in the cafeteria, and it was a joke. Like, I mean, we had $10 folding chairs. Our sound system was so bad in Nashville, I might add, that when it was time to get a new board, like we couldn't even give it away. Like if I put it on Craigslist next to a dead body, come get for free, we couldn't have gotten it. But that first day, Jay and Pam were there, and he stood in the back with his BlackBerry. He was still using a BlackBerry back then, and took a photo and sent it to the pastor of Lamb's Chapel in New York to say that it's still to this day because that Lamb's Chapel versus New York, I think that was 93. You would probably know before I would. But that case was, it was not a shoe-in. And the strategy was brilliant, right? He made it about equal access, which was brilliant. But to that, here it is, I mean, if any cursory drive around Middle Tennessee on a Sunday, almost every school has a church.
Right.
And one way to look at that is, oh man, there's churches everywhere. Does this town really know their church? And the other way to look at that is, and that is exactly how it should be, that our taxpayer dollars are funding this school, and we have access to that because we're Christians, and and one courageous pastor in New York City and one attorney. I joke because, Jay was 29 the first time he argued in front of the Supreme Court.
Wow.
At 29, I'm like selling rock bands, on the phone. Like I thought I was cool, but here he is arguing in front of the Supreme Court as a young man. But those cases, and by the way, the IRS case, like you guys, by bringing that to the light, you paid a personal price, but it isn't for nothing, because it is people now, and people for years to come will benefit that won't even know your name from it. But it wasn't ever about that, right? It was just about this is what's right.
Absolutely.
And I guess what I long for is, because I hear the excuses of, this it's expensive, whatever the cost is, that people won't pay that price for it. And again, on the one hand, there's empathy for that. On the other hand, this is not a time for cowardice.
No, it's fear. And fear is such a strong motivator, right? For bad. That's why Jesus tells us, and the scriptures tell us over and over and over again, fear not. It's not just don't be afraid, be comforted. It's because when you are fearful, you act irrationally. Hello, the big lie of 2020, right? And when you are fearful, you're not obedient, right? When Jesus tells us not to be afraid, that's a command. It's a command. That means when we are fearful, we're actually being disobedient. And fear drives so much of what the left does. And you pull back the curtain, you pull back the scales, and you realize, oh, I didn't really need to be afraid of that. That's your biggest tool.
One question I had for you, and this might poke the bear, so let's see what happens. You mentioned that when you were going through these legal proceedings almost a decade ago, if not longer, that your secular friends were kind of distancing themselves from you a little bit, but your Christian friends were like, go get them. Yeah, we got you. I'm curious over the landscape over the past 10 years, if that needle has moved.
Yes. It's a really interesting question. So now I always wonder every day when I get up, who's going to research my past and say, oh, Kevin, I can't have you represent me anymore. Because I don't hide what I do politically. I don't engage in social media, so I'm not out there that way. But I'm wholly engaged, and I've been very engaged. Gary and I have a podcast every week, very, very engaged. But that's a really good question, Mo, because here's what I've noticed. Some of my best relationships with clients are people that you would never imagine I would even represent. One of my favorite clients looks at the world completely different than I do. Client in LA thinks like secular LA thinks.
Sure.
And I don't know why this client continues to ask. I mean, we've got a great relationship, and I love serving this client, and this client has referred other people to me, but I still think I'm going to wake up one day and they're all going to say, you believe things entirely different than we do. And if that happens, it happens. On the other hand, I have had so-called professing Christians who absolutely reject what I do and what I believe. And that's, I don't know if it's not hurtful, it's revealing. It's really revealing because yes, there has been a shift. I would say 75%, unfortunately, because I've been doing this 33 years, 75% of the so-called Christian music industry mostly operates, whether they recognize it or not, consciously or unconsciously, I think it's a little bit of both, mostly operate according to a Marxist worldview.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. That's what I wanted to kind of dig out.
Yeah, and it grieves me to say that, but that's the reality we live in.
When you say Marxist worldview, unpack that.
Yeah, so that's a quick way of saying man is the center of the universe. God is not the authority. Here, let me tie a nice bow around it this way, because I know we're getting close to the end. The biggest exposure of the failure of Christian leadership happened in 2020. It's not like it wasn't bubbling under. But what you saw was, right, and I call it the big lie of 2020, because immediately you have a virus that just happened to come in an election year when the president in the office was hated by the media establishment, that just happened to lead to declaring some people essential and some non-essential, and you can't meet for church, but it's okay to go to the bar. You got to wear a mask, and if you want to live in society freely, you've got to take a toxin in your system, right? All of these things. But what did by and large, most of the Christian community do? And I'm talking about the political leadership. They accepted that premise, and then they went to their scriptures and say, what does the Bible say about social distancing? What does the Bible say about whether I should wear a mask to love my neighbor, right? When a Christian should be going and saying, wait a second, if God's word is ultimate and the Bible is true, the Bible tells me that man, every thought of every man is always sinful all the time. Genesis 6. Romans 3, right? No one is good. Maybe I ought to, I love Ronald Reagan, right? But he was wrong in his motto about trust but verify. Because that assumes, all right, it's predicated upon people being in good faith. It's not biblical to give people the benefit of the doubt. You should not give me the benefit of the doubt, and I should not give you the benefit of the doubt. God's word says that we're all sinners, and apart from Christ, no one deserves that benefit of the doubt. Had the Christians in 2020 said, wait a second, I reject the premise here. This is sinful man trying to achieve something else. Maybe we ought to challenge the premise. And that was the exposure of the failure of Christian leadership. And when I say they operate according to a Marxist worldview, they assume and accept man's diagnosis from the start. In fact, it was the Garden of Eden sin. Adam and Eve should have said, hey, Mr. Snake, God has declared that tree, right? It's not, in other words, are we taking reality based on God's declaration or on our own investigation? And the problem with doing it on our own investigation is we're putting ourselves at the top of the tree and saying we're going to decide what is true or not. That's what I mean by operating according to a Marxist worldview.
Yeah, I wanted you to say it because that some people, you hear Marxist worldview and they think, Stalin, which is true, but simplifying it down, exactly that is a Marxist worldview.
Right.
When I was in Israel of February of 2020, when this was all happening.
5 years ago, by the way.
5 years ago.
Not hard to believe.
It is impossible to believe.
Half a decade has passed.
And when we got back, we like most people, we were trying to catch up to this information. And, this church, the building, even where we're sitting right now, was just dirt.
Right.
But we'd kind of turned, like what was then the fellowship hall, was kind of like our little war room. We met with our staff. But, Mo and I would stay up late at night researching, European epidemiologists and we just wanted to know what the truth was. And probably the biggest shock to me was we're finding it was not unfindable. The truth was out there. That children were not at risk. It was all out there. I was naive enough to think, oh, this is great news. We should share this with everybody. They'll all be so excited. And that grieving process you're talking about with the friends, I had met with a group of pastors at that point once a month, and we were by far the smallest church. I don't even know why I got to go to that party, but one by one, all of these mega church guys that if I say some of their names, you might know them, they just fell into line. And, us, our little nickel and dime operation, we reopened pretty quickly. And it wasn't immediately obvious, by the way, that was a smart move. We were first Sunday back. I'm like, oh man, I might have killed this thing. But what was so sad to me was what you are describing in your Christian music colleagues. I experienced that with a lot of the pastors in our world. I still have empathy for those in those early days because you did have to work. You had to be a little bit of a nerd to figure it out. But about 3, 4, 5 months in, my empathy meter goes down for those, and for those that are still, espousing it, I'm like, I got no time for this at all.
Well, and it's really important that, and I've told both of you this personally, but it's important that we say this on the podcast. This is the reason that the Kookogey family came to Conduit. All through the big lie of 2020, we were discouraged at our church's response, and we would have Bible study and prayer time at the office for about a year straight. And I finally had a couple of people tell me, Kevin, Darren is speaking the truth. I'm like, Darren Tyler? Guy used to be in the music industry?
I've heard that name before.
They said, yes, you should listen to what he's saying, and they encouraged me to come. And the thing that we appreciate, Darren, is that you've always been so honest and transparent about your change and your shift. And that's what's important, right? You've repudiated what you did the first couple of weeks. You said, I never should have shut it down, right? And you've said, and if they try to do it again, we're going to open it. If they close us, we're going to go in the parking lot. If we go to the parking lot, we're going to, right? I would appreciate if some of the other Christian leaders would at least do that. And yet we don't. Yeah, they think that's grading on a curve. Well, we did better than that church or this. It's like, no, be honest, repudiate your past, and move forward. And so we so respect that's what you've done at Conduit, and that's why we came here.
Well, we're grateful that you came. And that, of all the downside that we experienced in that era, the upside is, it's like the deck got reshuffled,
Mm-hmm.
and I found my people.
Yeah, absolutely. The deck got reshuffled all across the world.
Yeah.
Alignments of people that you never thought that you would be aligning with.
Yeah.
And at some other time, you should have me come back and I'll talk about individual stories of people who have a different kind of transition from the left to sold out Christianity because of this.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, we will, and we'll have you back, because there was just a poll that was released this last week that Gen Z is following Christians at almost 2 or 3 times the level of their parents, of the Gen Xers. I believe it.
Yep.
And they're trying to figure out what's happening, and the answer is really simple. They've been living around, they've been lied to.
Yeah.
So they're just looking for truth somewhere.
Amen. And
truth. If you're genuinely looking for truth, it always leads back to Jesus. And so we'll definitely have you back, because I want to talk through those individual stories. And I think that's what we need right now are those kinds of stories, but the inspiration. I don't want to say permission, because sometimes I'm like, well, who are you waiting for permission for to speak up? If you're the pastor, speak. Yeah. And at the same time, in our church family, to say that, it's one thing to come here on a Sunday and, hear me say something, truthful, but you guys Sunday through Sunday are in the world. And while not everybody is called to, run for political office, I'm pretty convinced at this point in my life that we're all called to speak, all called to engage,
Amen.
to get involved. There's the time for nuance is long gone.
Amen.
The seeker-sensitive movement biblically didn't work politically either. We're actually getting ready to start a series on Jonah this Sunday.
Excellent.
And, part of that is that when God called Jonah to Nineveh, he wasn't calling him to give a watered-down message. Mm-hmm. It was repent.
Yes.
This wicked generation, it was a repentance message. And the seeker-sensitive movement over the years has taught us that that's an offensive word. It drives people away. It's utter nonsense.
It's salvation.
Yeah.
If we don't repent, we're not saved. The worst thing you can do is to keep a person from repenting.
Yes. That's why my pastor friends, and God bless my pastor friends in Asia, and I'm so thankful for them, because they're but for the grace of God, right? Had I not experienced what the logical conclusion of this, I didn't have to wait for the California refugees to come. Which, by the way, we love them because they know what can happen at the state level.
Absolutely.
So I am listening to my California friends that live here, because it is we are not immune to that here, whether it's from a Republican or a Democrat
Amen.
side. So but thank you.
No, I'm honored. Thanks
here.
for letting me be here. I hope I didn't talk your ears off too much. You get me excited, and I can just kind of roll.
No, this is great. Thanks for holding the line.
What we wanted, yeah.
I appreciate it.
Holding the line of truth, and obviously there's some more conversation that we can have. We'll have to run this back.
Love it.
Sooner than later. If you're still listening, and I know that you are, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, we ask that you do that. And maybe just leave a review, leave a note. If you got any prayer requests, you have any comments about this podcast, info@conduitchurch.com. We're so glad that you enjoyed us today.